with the government and politics reporter for the Detroit Free Press. We're pleased to be joined now by Dave Boucher on the Oakland County Megacast. Dave, thank you for being with us today.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Appreciate having you on. Over the course of the pandemic, how have you been? How's your team at the Free Press been doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm actually kind of a new hire at the Free Press, and so I've met all of my colleagues digitally, but we have been practicing social distancing, and everybody's doing the best that we can.
That's good to hear. It had to be an interesting time though, coming in, being such a new employee in an office in a situation that tends to be very social and very interactive as you're trying to get the news out to the public in an effective manner and in a speedy manner as well. And then coming in during the pandemic, having to form those relationships in the office, in the community, and continue to still report the news in a time that is so news heavy. How much of a challenge was that for you coming in, and how are you handling it so far?
It's been fun. It's been fun. I think it's a challenge for anybody to start a new job, but that sort of challenge pales in comparison to the challenges that Michiganders and everybody every day are facing right now with the pandemic. And so, I've just tried to hit the ground running and call and email as many people as I can, and everybody's been gracious so far and helpful with their time, and just trying to put out as much relevant, helpful news as I can as fast as possible.
That's good to hear, and we are very appreciative of the news that is reported by our local papers. They do a fantastic job. So, on the topic of the election, a very special scenario that we were in. There wasn't necessarily a special election, it was a primary election, but it was special in its own way, given the circumstances of the pandemic, the critical election year that it is in 2020 as we're approaching the general election in November, and the circumstances certainly were different in this election than ever before, as it was the first election that people were able to have no reason absentee voting and same-day registration. From what you've heard out in the community, from local clerks, from local county clerks and municipal clerks, and from just those in the general community, what's your review on how this election went? We expected some delays, we expected it to be a little slower, but all in all, it seemed like it went pretty smoothly.
Yeah, that's honestly the feedback that we're getting from most people. The Secretary of State's office says everything overall went very well, and it shows that everybody is ready for November. We've heard from clerks around the state where they saw that lines at polling precincts were down. They expected foot traffic to be down, and it was down. Some of the problems that we did hear about, your viewers and listeners have probably heard about them. Coming out of Detroit, there were some poll workers who did not show up, and that resulted in some of the polling precincts not being able to open on time. There were 3 polling precincts at least who didn't open on time. One of them didn't open until 9 o'clock. Polls are supposed to open at 7 a.m. So that's a delay. And so some voting rights advocates and others are a little bit concerned about what that means for November. There were other concerns specifically in Detroit about polling place locations. The clerk told me, James Winfrey told me that their office was caught a little off guard when Detroit Public Schools decided to have summer school this year. And so there were about 20 polling places in Detroit that are supposed to be schools. The school district didn't necessarily feel comfortable having polling places in the school while students were there for summer school, which the clerk said she completely understood, but it forced them to kind of look for some last minute changes, what she described as last minute changes. And so we heard from voters who were a little bit frustrated when they got a memo or a letter in the mail on the Monday before the election that said, no, you're not going to vote at this place where you've always voted. You're going to vote somewhere else. I talked to a poll worker in Detroit who said that all day they had people coming in and they were shocked that they were supposed to be voting there, or they weren't sure if that was the right polling precinct to be at. So those are some of the logistical issues. But again, that was focused in Detroit. That was some of the there are 500 plus precincts in Detroit, so it wasn't massively spread out, but it was a point of concern. And then, of course, as you mentioned, these are strange times, and so many more voters voted via absentee, via a mail-in ballot, or dropped off these absentee ballots early. And so some of that counting took some time. So some clerks are a little bit nervous about how much time they're going to need and how many more people they're going to need to count all the ballots that they anticipate receiving for the November general election.
So, Dave, speaking about the November election, if you had a crystal ball, what problems do you foresee for the general election, which could have extremely high voter turnout?
Yeah, so it's tough to predict everything, especially in the unpredictable times that we're living in right now. But if the pandemic remains at current levels or gets worse, as some people anticipate, participation in absentee ballots is expected to remain very, very high. This election, there were roughly 1.6 million, a little bit more than 1.6 million absentee ballots that were cast in Michigan. Election experts expect that that could go up to 3 million absentee ballots, if not more, for the November general election. And so clerks are a little bit nervous about having the number of the right amount of staff and the machinery necessary to count ballots. Counting ballots sounds like a relatively simple and perhaps monotonous or tedious process, but it just requires time, people, and equipment to do that. So clerks have high-speed tabulators. They have high-speed envelope openers. That's a thing that I didn't know existed. But when you're opening, 100,000 envelopes, like it takes some time to open up the envelopes. So just the timing and the logistics are a little bit nerve-wracking for clerks. Also, the way that Michigan law is set up right now, clerks can't even open absentee ballots until the morning of the election. So, for example, the city of Lansing had 17,000 absentee ballots. The city of Detroit had 75,000 plus absentee ballots, and they can't even open, let alone count those ballots until the morning of the election. And so there's some legislation that is proposed that while it wouldn't allow clerks to count ballots, it allowed them to, at the very least, open up the envelopes and process these ballots so that they could start the counting process a little bit earlier. Clerks are telling me if that law doesn't change, that's just going to mean that it's going to take longer for them to do everything. It means they're going to have to try and hire more election workers, which is a problem all over the state. So if they can't hire more people and if the ballots stay high, it could just result in a delay in getting results in November.
Dave Boucher with us. He's a government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press with us on the Oakland County Megacast. Dave, on that topic, you mentioned the legislation that's been thrown out there with the potential of allowing these clerks to at least open those ballots before the day of the election and begin the counting process. Do you believe, based on your conversations or your knowledge with, in terms of members of the legislature and even Governor Whitmer to that level, that this would be legislation that could pass in time for November and be in place to allow these clerks that relief that they are calling for the November general election, where turnout is expected to be much higher than it was in this primary?
I would say that's hard to say. In general, in theory, when legislation has support from Republicans and Democrats, it seems like the likelihood of it passing goes up, right? And so there's legislation that's been introduced by Senator Ruth Johnson, the former Republican Secretary of State in Michigan, that would allow clerks to, at the very least, open the envelope, not take the ballot out, but open the envelope before Election Day. So that bill has been introduced. Some people believe that it's a popular bill, but it hasn't been passed yet. So we're digging in a little bit more to kind of see what some of the fears there or concerns are there. In general, we think that some of the concerns about opening up ballots a little early are around fear of either voter fraud or, if people start counting ballots early, then maybe the results of the count get out and it affects the ultimate voter tally. Now, I'm sure you guys know this too, but many states around the country do early voting and mail-in voting. Oregon only does mail-in voting. And so, other states have figured out how to count ballots that come in the mail or come early and not let those results get out until polls close. And so I think that's kind of what supporters of this are saying. They're saying, we understand concerns, but again, really hard to open 20,000 ballots in one day. And so we'll see in the legislation. I would anticipate that it'll be brought up again. There's a push from the Secretary of State and the governor to try and make that happen. So I would anticipate that, there could be some movement on that once lawmakers reconvene.
Dave, this is an exciting time to be covering the government and politics. But as someone who has covered politics in this area for a while, especially in the city of Detroit, how is the pandemic helping or hurting you trying to do your job? And do you think it's limiting transparency for citizens?
Yeah, that's a fair question. I'm still kind of getting my feet wet and understanding, there's a lot that I don't know. So far, it hasn't been a huge hindrance for me, but I know that other reporters, especially reporters this week, have some concerns about when it comes to access. There's obviously reporters and the public have a right to public information. And so, for example, when press conferences are not held in person, and when press conferences, when public officials ask for questions ahead of time for press conferences, that kind of limits the ability of what we're able to do and kind of gets away from the heart of how public officials are supposed to interact with their constituents. So that can be frustrating. That being said, I've been calling people as essentially a random person in Detroit throughout the state the last couple of weeks, and everybody's been gracious who's answered the phone and has been very helpful in the information that I've been able to get. it's a different time. It's reporting is always a challenge, but it hasn't been overwhelming, and we're doing the best we can to serve our readers and our viewers.
Dave Boucher with us, government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press. Just a couple more minutes with you, Dave. Going back to the primary election, we've talked at length about how the clerks felt about this election, how the process and the processes that were in place, and how what they feel needs to be in place for November. What about the voters themselves? From what you've heard, either in your work or from other reporters at the Free Press, what's the voters' thoughts on how this process went down in the August primary during this pandemic, and are they confident that it's going to be a smooth process in November, where things may be a little more chippy politically?
Yeah, so overall, the reader feedback that we received is that they thought the election went relatively well. I mean, we heard from a lot of readers who received their absentee ballot on time and were able to either mail it in or to put it in a drop box and then check the Secretary of State's website and see that it was received. We did hear from a fair number of people, too, though, that had just questions about mail-in voting or had concerns about mail-in voting. I've heard from both voters and from poll workers that people requested an absentee ballot and either never received that absentee ballot, before the election, or they mailed in the absentee ballot but couldn't guarantee that the clerk received it by the election. That's important because in Michigan, only those absentee ballots that are received by clerks by the time polls close, 8 p.m. on election day, are valid. Those are the only ones that count. And so we did hear from some readers about that. And so we talked to the Secretary of State, we talked to clerks, and they're encouraging everyone, if they're going to vote absentee, to vote as early as possible. You can start requesting ballots, to start doing that process early. Put it in the mail as early as you can. I think people understand that there are the U.S. Postal Service is stretched pretty thin. There's a high demand on that right now. And if you're not confident in the mail system, there are drop boxes around the state. You can find the location on the Secretary of State's website. Some jurisdictions have more than others. You can always drop off your ballot at the appropriate clerk's office as well, or cast the absentee ballot early at the appropriate clerk's office. So there were a lot of questions about some of the logistics of everything, but overall, the people who voted in person and the people who voted absentee said that they felt relatively safe and relatively confident in the polls.
Dave, anything else you'd like to touch on today before we let you go?
I really appreciate you having me on. It's been exciting to move back to my home state and to cover this process, and looking forward to covering the November general.
Dave, real quick before we let you go, since you are new in town, how can people reach you if they're watching or listening, or if they have tips they want to send you?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. You can find me on Twitter at Dave_Boucher1. My email is B as in boy, OUCHER @freepress.com. And so you can reach me very easily either way. I would love to hear any tips or feedback that you have, and look forward to hearing from you.
Dave, thank you very much for being with us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Appreciate your time as well. Dave Boucher, government and politics reporter at the Detroit Free Press, with us on the Oakland County Megacast.